Hello, and a very warm welcome to the STUDIOCANAL Presents podcast. My name is Simon Brew from Film Stories magazine, and this is a regular podcast celebrating one of the biggest and deepest film libraries in the world. STUDIOCANAL's extensive library of over 6,000 films brings together cinema from around the globe. There are Best Picture Oscar winners such as The Deer Hunter and The Hurt Locker, vintage classics such as the original Dunkirk film and Billy Liar. And how about a bit of action with Raw Deal and Free Fire? For this episode, stepping into the spotlight is a brand new Blu-ray collection of Alfred Hitchcock's early films entitled Hitchcock: The Beginning. Film historian and critic Henry Miller is just about to join me to talk about the movies. Before that, here's a taste of some early Hitchcock for you.
Ben, I've changed my mind again.
What about?
About going to the pictures.
You mean you don't want to go again?
No, not particularly.
And why not?
I don't know. I just don't want to. Isn't that enough?
No, it's not enough. Hi, Liz.
What are you going to do?
I'm going to get the bill. I'm about fed up with you. You don't want to go, I do.
Oh, all right. I'll come too.
Hi, Miss.
Henry, hello. A very warm welcome to the STUDIOCANAL Presents podcast. Thank you for joining us.
Pleased to be here.
Well, you say that, and then I ask you the question I ask of all of our guests as they join for the first time. If you can just tell us a little film fact about yourself. Let's get to know you a little bit. The first film you saw, something like that.
I think the first film that I saw, or that I can remember seeing, was The Goonies, and feeling slightly cheated that it wasn't Back to the Future, but I'm sure that they're both equally good films.
Henry, are you saying you walked out The Goonies angry as a youngster?
Oh no, I think I was satisfied by the end of the film when the ship kind of... I've never really understood the ship sailing away at the end of the film, but it's just as good as Back to the Future, I'm sure. I'm sure that message was imposed upon me.
Imposed upon you. The internet will stop attacking us now for This Hitchcock: The Beginning box set is an 11-disc set with 10 of Alfred Hitchcock's early films. And I mean, I'm looking at the list of films here. I'm just going to quickly go through them. I mean, it's an extraordinary lineup. So 1927's The Ring. 1928's The Farmer's Wife and Champagne. Those are two separate films. From 1929, Blackmail and The Manxman. From 1930, Murder with an exclamation mark at the end. That's important. And Juno and the Paycock as well. At 1931, it's The Skin Game and Rich and Strange. And 1932 is number 17. Now, you're nodding along to these with absolute recognition. And these are quite new to me. And I suspect they'll be new to quite a few people. Can you kind of just set the scene for us a little bit of where we find Alfred Hitchcock, say, 1927, at the point The Ring is being made?
He's a very young man when he starts on The Ring. He must have been 28 years old when he started shooting it, and that's his 6th feature film. And then he makes, as you've just described, he makes basically 2 films a year for the next 5 years. And he's working for a newly formed studio, British International Pictures, at a newly built studio plant, Elstree, which is still in operation today. And it's true that most of these films are not on the tips of most people's tongues all of these years later. It constitutes perhaps almost a fifth of Hitchcock's output, though, not insignificant. And in the middle of this group of films is definitely one of his most famous British films, which is Blackmail, which is not only his first sound film, but it's also, most people would accept, the first British talkie. Put an asterisk on that, but that's essentially the case.
He made a fifth of his output basically in a 5-year period.
Yeah, it's 10 films and he made 53 in total. And like I say, the first of them was his 6th, and he'd made those 5 films in an even shorter period of time. He made the first 5 films in a 2-year period.
So with The Ring, reading up on it, I mean, part of the appeal, it seemed, to Hitchcock was the idea of developing an idea and story of his own, rather than stage adaptations. And there was some contention, I think, over this being his only sole screenplay credit as well. Can you just take us into that just a little bit?
There's a credit dispute over The Ring, but it is the only one that I think is largely attributed to Hitchcock. Credits are difficult partly because he is frequently working with his, by that point, wife, Alma Reville. They'd married about half a year before The Ring starts. I think you can assume that she's a contributor to, essentially, to all of his scripts. But also, in the case of The Ring, his friend, the newspaper, the Evening Standard's film critic, Walter Mycroft, claims in his autobiography to have contributed to the script. And there's also the figure of Elliot Stannard, who's a very significant film writer and had written... had contributed to the scripts at any rate of all of Hitchcock's previous films and continued to work with him. Stannard may have been in the mix, but The Ring is this moment when Hitchcock is really being pushed as a major director by this new studio. The two things kind of go together. The studio is promoting itself as basically a new force in British film production, and Hitchcock is, and his salary is big news. It's a large salary that he's on. And that makes newspaper headlines. It may even make the front page. It's a big deal that is being made of him. Prior to this point, he has one major movie to his credit before then, which is The Lodger. But he's actually working on a larger scale at Elstree. It's the first really kind of American scale studio in Britain. And it's also a new kind of film production company in that it owns a chain of cinemas across the country. It's operating in an American way like that as well. And in a way, the British film industry that produced kind of all of the movies of the decades that came, 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, when you had a very strong British film industry, that only really begins in 1927 because there is government legislation to protect the British film industry. Up until this point, Hitchcock's first films were made in a period when the cinema screens of Britain were absolutely dominated by American films. They were kind of at least 95% American. And well, we've kind of gone back to that situation now. But what happens at this moment in the mid 1920s is the government legislates to say, if you own a cinema, you have to show a set proportion of British films. If you distribute films in Britain, they have a certain proportion of them have to be British made. That creates a protected space and a guaranteed market for British films. And so British International Pictures is essentially, it's formed to move into that space. It gives them the confidence to build this large studio at Elstree, and other companies large companies come into being in the same way, principally Gaumont British, which Hitchcock eventually works for. And so this is kind of when British films go into the big time. And so The Ring is a combination of these things, of a new studio. It's not the actual first film, but it's one of the early films from British International, and also Hitchcock kind of capitalising on the success of The Lodger. And it would be easy to say that he never looks back, but that's not quite true. The end of his time at British International is kind of the doldrums for Hitchcock, but it's nevertheless a very interesting period of doldrums. We shouldn't neglect any of these films. They all have points of interest, and many of them look forward to the future. One
of the things that struck me looking down the list of the films, I think most people who come to Hitchcock assume thriller straight off the bat, but there are romances and rom-coms in here. I'm looking at things like The Farmer's Wife and The Manxman and Rich and Strange. I mean, what does an Alfred Hitchcock romance look like?
I've written a book about Hitchcock, and so clearly I'm an admirer. It's not necessarily his forte, but he's capable of turning them out. I mean, The Farmer's Wife is a hugely successful play which he's adapting. So following The Ring, perhaps this is slightly running for cover, he adapts a very successful play, but he uses it to experiment. It's the first Hitchcock film with a significant amount of camera movement. And so you can see in this the genesis of Rope, essentially. It's largely confined to a single location, and there's a lot of camera movement. And these are things which fascinate him and that he returns to throughout his career.
Yeah, you say he was using genre and using these as experiments as well. I mean, what kind of things should we be? It's inevitable we look to later Hitchcock a little bit. I just wondered, what do we see the infancy of?
One of the most interesting arguments I've read about them is from Charles Barr, who did the the major investigative work on Blackmail, comparing the two versions, silent and sound.
Yeah.
With that film, it's only a part talkie. There are scenes of dialogue, but then there are quite long passages where there's music, but there isn't any dialogue because of the extremely complicated genesis of the sound version of the film. But what Charles says in his book about Vertigo is that you can see the same kind of alternation there. Vertigo is a film that alternates somewhat quite long dialogue scenes set in a single location, and then long passages where there isn't any dialogue, that, especially in the sequences where James Stewart is following Kim Novak around, you are in just essentially using music and maybe a bit of sound. And so he traces the lineage of at least some of Vertigo in Blackmail in that way.
I'm curious as well. I mean, you talked about British International Pictures there, and by the sounds of it, he was their star signing. I'm just wondering how much agency he had over his choices. Was he picking the projects, or were they coming to him?
I'm going to level with you. It's not that clear. Because a lot of what we know about Hitchcock comes from things that he said a long time later that I don't think are completely trustworthy in every instance. And my surmise is that The Farmer's Wife was not necessarily dear to his heart. Yeah. But on the other hand, I think that Juno and the Paycock, which is also adapted from stage production, probably was. It's an unusual choice for a film.
It's an unusual name for a film.
Yeah, I mean, it's set during the Irish Civil War in 1922. It's one of very, very few Hitchcock films to have any kind of political resonance whatsoever.
Interesting.
Very interesting choice that he does it. I would have thought that Blackmail was his choice and so on and so forth. But it's never completely clear, because he would sort of semi-disown films or say that the studio made me do it. He's very dismissive of some of these films, which I think are very interesting, in particular number 17, which is one I've written about, which is the last one that he made there. He said very little about it, and so it's gone down in the history books and the biographies as a kind of an unhappy project. And it's certainly a strange project. Yeah. That it's very short. It's only just over an hour long, and it may well have been his second choice. But at the same time, it's extremely close to the kind of stuff that he would do generally. So I don't believe that it was something that was absolutely he was made to do. I think these things can be a bit more complicated than that.
So all of these 10 films were new to me, and so I thought, you're coming on the podcast, I'm going to pick one of these just at random. I'm going to watch it and just come to it completely cold. Henry, I think I struck gold, because I picked Blackmail unaware of the background of it, and since then I've read into the background of it. But Blackmail is, quite a film. It's filthy. For one part, not by modern standards, but certainly you can see by the period of the day, that's quite contentious. But is it the first 8.5 minutes, you just think you're getting a silent film, and then it just flicks? And there was some behind the scenes jiggery-pokery going on.
It's an unbelievably complicated story. And I think that now that it's on Blu-ray, I wonder if it will give people the chance to do the detective work. As I've said, Charles Barr did the groundwork on this 40 years ago, but obviously that's well before even. I don't think the silent version's ever been on a home release. So doing that work, you would have to have booked in to look at the actual film prints and so on. Anyway, what's going on with this film is that Hitchcock's story is that it begins. He started shooting it as a silent film. And then eventually the studio said, actually, this is happening during the transition to sound. So everything is in flux. No one really knows what's going to happen. And the studios are rapidly installing sound recording equipment and things like this. And so he starts shooting it silent. This is the story. But eventually the suits say, okay, actually, we need some talking sequences in this film. But the Hitchcock story is that I knew that this was going to happen all along, and so I planned it this way. So I shot stuff that we could use in a sound version, and then he would do some. But then when he did have the sound equipment installed, he would be reshooting stuff in sound versions. It's all very complicated, but also both versions he was shooting two negatives of. Charles thought this was as part of his preparation for it being a sound film. Possibly it was because in those days it was not unusual to shoot two negatives, one for export, one for the domestic market. But either way, the silent version contains shots that were done after the introduction of sound, and vice versa. So it's an unbelievably complicated genesis. Somebody needs to do the work on it. But Charles's examples are that in one version of it, there's a clock that says, 11:52, and in the next version, and then in the other version, the clock says it's 11:56. Clearly, these two shots were taken 4 minutes apart. This is like a close-up. One version's in the sound version, one version's in the silent version. It's all like that. So the story behind Blackmail is fascinating, but it's one of the first films that has been written about extensively in Hitchcock studies as it's evolved. Tanya Modilewski, who's the author of the kind of foundational feminist book on Hitchcock's films, begins with Blackmail, for instance.
Also is a film that has the most amazing tiff with a couple disagreeing about going to the cinema. I mean, it's just delightful. It's just like, I'm going, I'm not going, I'm going, I'm not going. It's quite hard to do scenes like that justice, but I just found it full of little moments that just put a massive grin on my face.
It's full of great things. Annie Ondra, who is the Czech actress who's in that, she was kind of the first Hitchcock blonde, I think it's fair to say. There had been blonde women in previous Hitchcock films, but she was really good. And part of the story of Blackmail is that she didn't speak good, or at least unaccented English, and so she is being live dubbed through the film. She's mouthing the lines, and an English actress, Joan Barry, is to one side actually saying the lines, which was the kind of invention that was, I mean, that's almost a somewhat trivial invention, but still an interesting one. But what Hitchcock wanted to do with this early sound film, the thing he was desperate to avoid, was this concept he would label later photographs of people talking. He thought that cinema needed a lot of movement, a lot of cutting, and it would not be good if we just filmed people sitting around talking. And so even when he does films like Rope later on, the challenge, because that is set in a single flat, the challenge was to make this interesting. And of course a lot of films are people talking being photographed, and so that's for him the challenge, to create pure cinema out of it. And he's doing it from the jump. He's doing it from Blackmail, his first talking film. He's trying to make it as interesting as possible. There's a very famous scene that's in sort of every book of film aesthetics up until about the 1960s would refer to a scene in Blackmail where Annie Ondra, who has killed somebody in self-defense, she's stabbed the man to death. The next morning she is triggered by seeing and also hearing the word knife at the breakfast table. And so in the movie, in the sound version, you have this like repeated and distorted repetition of the word knife. In the silent version, it's more kind of an expressionistic image of a knife that haunts her. But that knife, the sound version of the knife bit, was written about over and over again as an example of how sound can be non-realistic. I suppose like realism was for many film critics what you wanted to avoid, not in terms of truth to life, but of statically reproducing what was there. That was seen as a big no-no, and so Hitchcock's invention of sound was perceived as, the way out.
I mean, you said he liked his pictures moving as well. I mean, he opens with a car chase, doesn't he? I mean, that's like a fairly dramatic and arresting thing for a 1929 movie. I'm also really taken with this idea that there were two versions of the film, because as I understand it, the vast majority of cinemas at the end of the 1920s couldn't show the sound version anyway, that the majority of people were watching the silent version then.
I don't want to go into numbers. I don't think it's going to be the majority, but that process, I will shout out to Jeff Brown's new book about the transition to sound, which I haven't quite got round to reading. I think that Jeff Brown's book will explain all of this. But the transition is happening throughout that year. And so the sound version of the film debuts in the summer of 1929. The general release, so in those days you'd open the film in the West End of London and it would play exclusively in one venue for a bit. Then it's released in the autumn. I think that it was fairly widely, by that point, the autumn of 1929, a lot of people are seeing sound films as they're intended. But the more sort of neighbourhood, suburban cinemas, of course in those days there were many more cinemas. I think that they were slower to adapt. So it's hard to know numbers. I haven't researched the numbers.
I won't hold you to the numbers, Henry, don't worry. Was Hitchcock as a filmmaker and within the studio getting more powerful? I mean, you look at something like Rich and Strange, and as I understand it, he's building a full-size ship in a water tank and getting the resources to do things like that. Is there a little element of that?
No, he's coming into it. What's happening at this point is some very strange headwinds are coming Hitchcock's way. Yeah. And trying to interpret them, again, I think it's better to be open about the limits of what we know. What happens after Richard and Strange is that he shoots this shortish film, like hour-long film, number 17, which has no stars in it, and which I think is produced on a slightly lower budget than some of these other films. Richard and Strange is perceived not to have been a great success. But then what happens is that Hitchcock is named as being a supervising producer for British independent pictures. He's going to raise other people up to become directors at BIP or at Elstree, and there's very little result of this, but he spends an entire year, really, 1932, of not making any films and of being rumoured to be moving somewhere else. And eventually, after this full year, he leaves British International. He goes initially to work for Alexander Korda. This is at the beginning of his very well-known name in British cinema, but this is before he's made The Private Life of Henry VIII, which is his big breakthrough. Nothing comes of this alliance with Korda, and so there's quite a big gap in Hitchcock's career at the end of the British International period. So it doesn't see him going from strength to strength. He makes Blackmail, which is a huge deal and fairly successful. I don't think that Juno's a big hit, but then he does Murder, which is another, classic Hitchcock territory. Well, largely it's a murder mystery, so it's more of a whodunit than he's used to doing. But Murder is solidly well received. It stars Herbert Marshall, who goes on to have this major Hollywood career. But I think that Hitchcock slightly stumbles at that point when he makes The Skin Game, which is adapted from a John Galsworthy play, and Rich and Strange, which is adapted from a novel. And I'm not denying that there's a certain investment in these films, but clearly there's some sort of a falling out. His career doesn't follow a linear trajectory from novice to maturity. He goes through a difficult patch around 31, 32, although this is it's a very difficult patch within the British economy generally, and I wonder if these things are slightly related. British International starts out, with the name International, as a very ambitious enterprise, and Hitchcock, I don't know if you mentioned earlier if he's a star name. He's definitely a big name, but they've also brought over E.A. DuPont and Arthur Robeson, who are well known for having made important films in Germany. So that's partly its internationalism, is that it has German directors working there who made films like Piccadilly and The Informer, which are very big deal films of late 1920s. But I think it lowers its sights. British International, shortly after Hitchcock leaves, renames itself Associated British, and it's connected with what is at a certain point called the ABC cinema chain, which many listeners will be familiar with. I think there's still ABC cinemas even in 2024, but there certainly were when I was growing up. Yeah. So it's a major film producer, but essentially for the domestic market, whereas the other major British studio, Gaumont British, which is where Hitchcock ends up, has its eyes on America and has its eyes on international success in a way that I think that British International itself had shrunk back from. It doesn't actually all end happily for Gaumont, but then British cinema is always in a state of semi-crisis. But Hitchcock went to Gaumont British and made films which are probably going to be better known to people listening, like The 39 Steps and like The Man Who Knew Too Much, and those are the films that establish him internationally. But I would say that many of the British International films also played in the United States. Blackmail played in the United States, was recognised as an important film at the time. And I'd also say that these films were, many of them have higher standards of craftsmanship than the Gaumont British ones. I think that Elstree is a better equipped studio than Shepherd's Bush, where he was making those films for Gaumont. Right. That's partly subjective, but these films are all don't get the impression that because they're old and some of them silent that there's anything primitive about them. These are films made at an extremely high level, and they're not works of juvenilia or anything like that.
So, I mean, going through this list, I mean, if you can recommend to listeners one of those other 9, we've talked about Blackmail a lot. Is there another one in there that's a particular curiosity or a particular standout for you?
Yes, I want to nominate number 17. It's one that I've written about in the booklet for the box set, but I did not talk about, perhaps eccentrically, I did not talk about what I think is extremely striking in this film, is that it is, I'll say it, I think it's Hitchcock's best action sequence.
Okay.
He's not necessarily, it's an interesting one of Hitchcock. What we know him for are, I would say, primarily spy movies and murder mysteries. Both of them can lead to action sequences, and of course that's North by Northwest springs readily to mind among his best known films, and arguably, I suppose, To Catch a Thief as well. Number 17, though, ends with, it's only an hour, and so it's an hour and 5 minutes or something like that long, and around about 15 minutes or more at the end of the film is an extended chase between a train and a bus, and it's often written about saying, well, there's a lot of model shots in this, and it is true that at the end of the sequence, to give it away, there's an almighty smash up at the end. Let's put it that way, which is very obviously shot with models, but perhaps I'm credulous, but watching this in its pristine new restored version, loads of this is not models. I'm going to go out on the limb and say, because there are stuntmen working on these scenes. They are human beings on top of a train and so on. And I think it's a remarkable sequence. It's definitely it's probably the longest Hitchcock action sequence, and I find it more convincing than something like North by Northwest, where he's using kind of matte photography or rear projection extensively. Right. He becomes very famous for his use of rear projection in the American films, and extremely highbrow critics will say that, this is actually more interesting, that it's unbelievable, and you don't really think that anyone's actually in that car. I don't really agree with that, and I think that number 17, which has it's very thrilling. It's very well cut. It's the classic train versus bus chase, and I'd highlight number 17 for that reason. But there are other things that film has to recommend it as well. It's interesting that it seems to contain a kind of a knowing reference to Hitchcock's what's called the first true Hitchcock film, The Lodger. Number 17 seems to have a kind of an act of self-homage, which is quite bold for such a young director. I think it tells us something about Hitchcock's fame and at this point in his career. The kind of thing that you hear quite often is that it's only in the 1950s, with the French critics of Cahiers du Cinéma, that Hitchcock becomes a well-known person or sort of critically respected. And this is beyond nonsense. Hitchcock had been a very, very prominent and well-known film director since the mid-1920s. And so by 1932, he's practically in his prime.
Interesting. So the Hitchcock, just to round that off, the Hitchcock we meet in 1927's just got this fat contract from a new studio. The one who we meet in 1932 is a couple of years away from some of his most revered films and making his best action sequence.
In my view, it is a better action sequence than you will find in those better known films of the later 1930s. Not to disparage them at all, but I find this a more satisfying chase sequence. It's out of all proportion to the length of the film, which I think makes it even better.
I love it.
Because it's pure chase, it's pure action, and there's a space within the cinema for that. I mean, for me, that's a large part of what cinema is. It's about buses chasing trains. I'd stick up for the film for that reason.
For those of us of a certain age as well, the idea of a 65-minute film is just absolute bliss.
Absolutely, yes.
Hitchcock: The Beginning is available on Blu-ray from the 16th of December 2024. Henry, thank you so much. Before we let you go, we ask all of our guests to pick out a double bill from the STUDIOCANAL catalogue. Have you gone for Hitchcock? What have you gone for?
No, that would be too obvious. And there were many British films, many tempting British films, such as films by Powell and Pressburger and Thorold Dickinson, which I also did not choose. As a double bill, I choose two films from what I regard as the golden age of European art cinema. The first film is going to be Pierrot Le Fou, Jean-Luc Godard's film from 1965. It's impossible really to choose one Jean-Luc Godard film, and so I chose the one that was very important to Chantal Akerman. It's kind of the film that turned her into director by her own account. And for the second one, I chose Les Clis by Antonioni, a remarkable film with Monica Vitti and Alain Delon, which has this absolutely staggering final sequence where I don't want to spoil it. But it's an absolutely staggering final sequence that really relies on architecture alone. I mean, both of these directors, of course, appreciated Hitchcock. Godard wrote about him. Antonioni made a film that could practically be called The Lady Vanishes, famously, and then made The Passenger, which is so closely related to North by Northwest. Yeah. So there are links, but these two films are marvellous, and they really shaped me when I was getting into movies.
And cunning choices as well, just with the Hitchcock link at the end. Pierre et Le Fou and Les Clis are both available on the STUDIOCANAL Presents channel on Prime Video, Apple TV Plus and ITVX. Henry, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Just time for a quick bit of news from the world of STUDIOCANAL. Available now to watch at home is The Outrun, starring Saoirse Ronan and Papa Essiedu. Following its cinema run in the autumn, the acclaimed drama is available now on video on demand to buy and rent. It's also going to be on DVD and Blu-ray from the 16th of December. And a release to look forward to next year is a 4K restoration of Anthony Harvey's 1968 classic, The Lion in Winter. The historical drama, starring Katharine Hepburn and Peter O'Toole, won 3 Oscars, including a Best Actress prize for Hepburn. A new disc is heading our way in 2025. I'll be back soon with the next episode of STUDIOCANAL Presents. Until the next time, to get all the news on STUDIOCANAL films as it happens, and to find out more about the ITVX, Apple TV and Prime Video channels, you can visit www.studiocanal.co.uk or follow STUDIOCANAL at STUDIOCANAL UK on X, Instagram and TikTok. For now, I've got 9 more Hitchcock films to watch and a whole lot of Hitch cameos to try and spot. Ta-ta for now.